Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? Why do the rulers of this world, the kings and princes, conspire against God and His Anointed One? Welcome to Daily Prayer, your moment to breathe, reflect, and reconnect with God. Today, we turn to Psalm 2, a powerful and prophetic psalm that speaks about the rebellion of the world and the sovereign rule of God. It begins with a question. Why do the nations rage? Why do people fight against God's will and seek to break His authority over their lives? The answer, it seems, is not a new one. From the beginning of time, humanity has sought to free itself from the Creator's reign. But in doing so, they are only deceiving themselves, because God's sovereignty is unshakable. In Psalm 2, we see the kings and rulers of the earth conspiring together to throw off God's rule. They say, "Let us break their chains and throw off their fetters." This is a spirit of rebellion, one that sees God's authority as a burden. They want to live without restraint, to do things their own way. But what they fail to realize is that God's rule is not a burden. It is the source of peace, joy, and life. In His law, we find freedom. In His commands, we find life. His sovereignty is not something to be feared, but something to be embraced. The world may rage, the nations may plot, but there is no power greater than God. He is the Creator, the Sustainer, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. His throne is established forever. The rulers of this world may scheme and fight against Him, but they will not prevail. Psalm 2 reminds us that no matter how loud the rebellion, God's plan will not be thwarted. His authority will stand, and His kingdom will come. As we look around at the world today, it often feels as though the powers that be are constantly fighting against God's will. We see leaders who are more interested in their own power than in serving the people they are meant to lead. We see people turning away from God, seeking their own path and rejecting His truth. The spirit of rebellion in the world today is no different from what Psalm 2 describes. The same fight against God's rule is still happening. But in the midst of this rebellion, God is not passive. Psalm 2 tells us that the one who sits in the heavens laughs. God is not intimidated by the schemes of men. He does not panic when the rulers of the world act as though they have the power to overthrow Him. He laughs, not out of mockery, but because He knows the end of the story. The rebellion of the world will not last. His rule is eternal. No one can challenge His authority. And then God speaks. "I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill." God's plan is not just to laugh at the rebellion, but to establish His king, His anointed one, to reign over the earth. This is a direct reference to the Messiah, Jesus Christ, who was sent into the world to fulfill God's plan of salvation. Though the world rejects Him, though the nations rage against Him, God has already chosen His king, and He is seated at the right hand of the Father, reigning over all. God's declaration to His anointed one is clear. "Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession." Jesus is the King who will rule over all the nations, not with a temporary authority, but with an eternal one. His reign will be just, and He will bring peace and righteousness to the earth. All authority has been given to Him, but God also warns the rulers of the earth. "You shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel." The rebellion against God will not go unpunished. Those who oppose His rule will face the consequences. Their power is fleeting, their schemes futile. God's justice will prevail, and those who oppose His Son will be broken. And then the psalmist calls to the kings and rulers of the earth. "Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling." This is a call to humility, a call to recognize the sovereignty of God and to submit to His authority. It is a call to serve Him with reverence and awe, knowing that He is the one who holds all things in His hands. The rebellion against God's rule leads to destruction, but those who humbly submit to His authority will find peace. Finally, the psalm ends with a powerful reminder of the blessing that comes to those who trust in the Lord. Blessed are all who take refuge in Him, in the midst of the chaos and rebellion of the world. Those who trust in God's sovereignty will find peace. They will find refuge in His care. They will be blessed, for their hope is in the Lord, and His kingdom is unshakable. Psalm 2 is not just a warning to the rulers of the earth. It is a reminder to all of us that God's authority is supreme. His plan cannot be stopped, and His kingdom will come. Let us take refuge in Him, trusting that He will bring justice, peace, and righteousness to the earth. Let us serve Him with reverence and joy, knowing that He is the King of all. God's plan is unshakable, and no rebellion can overturn it. Despite all the plotting of the nations and the rulers, God's will remains firm. He is not surprised by the struggles or the opposition. He is not troubled by the plans of the world. The kingdoms of the earth may rise and fall, but God's reign is eternal. Psalm 2 speaks of a king who has already been established by God's anointed one, the Messiah. And this king, Jesus Christ, has been given authority over all things. The psalm reminds us that this king's rule is not temporary, it is everlasting. He is not a king who will fade into the background, but a ruler who will govern the earth with righteousness and justice. When we look around the world, it can be easy to think that human power and wisdom are what hold things together. Political leaders and nations seem to have all the control, but Psalm 2 reminds us that true authority comes from God alone. He has already chosen His king, and the victory is certain. Though the world may be in turmoil, God's plan will be accomplished through the Messiah. God's promise to the Messiah is that He will receive the nations as His inheritance. Every tribe, every nation, every corner of the earth belongs to Him. It's a promise of complete dominion over all creation, and this is a promise that is still being fulfilled today. As we see the gospel spread across the world, we are witnessing the expansion of God's kingdom. Jesus is the King who rules over the hearts of believers, and one day, He will return to establish His reign in full. But there is a challenge for the rulers of the earth, as well as for each of us. Psalm 2 calls us to recognize the power and authority of God. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. The kings and rulers are warned that they must humble themselves before God and recognize His supreme authority. They must not oppose His will, or they will face the consequences of their rebellion. This message is just as relevant today as it was when the psalm was written. Every day, people make choices about who they will serve. Will we follow the ways of the world, rebelling against God's authority, or will we submit to His rule, trusting in His wisdom and justice? There is no middle ground either. We embrace God's sovereignty or we oppose it, but the blessing for those who choose God's way is clear. Blessed are all who take refuge in Him. Those who seek refuge in God will be safe. They will find peace in His protection, joy in His presence, and purpose in His plan. These are the people who have chosen to serve the Lord, who recognize that He is the ultimate authority over all things. The rebellion of the world may seem loud and overwhelming at times, but it will not last. God's plan will come to pass. His anointed one, Jesus Christ, is the King who will reign forever, and those who trust in Him will experience the fullness of His kingdom. As we continue reflecting on Psalm 2, we see the dire consequences for those who oppose God's sovereignty. You shall break them with a rod of iron. You shall dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. This is a stark warning. Those who reject God's rule will face the justice of His King. The rod of iron represents the power and authority of the Messiah, who will govern with justice. The image of breaking vessels like pottery speaks of the fragility of the opposition. No matter how powerful the nations may seem, they are ultimately as fragile as clay before the authority of God. In this psalm, God makes it clear that the rebellion against His kingdom will not go unpunished. The powers that rise up against God's anointed one will be shattered. They cannot stand against His will, for He is the creator and sustainer of all things. Their rebellion may last for a season, but it will not endure. The kingdom of God is unshakable, and no earthly power can overthrow it. But even in this warning, God's invitation is clear. There is still time to turn to Him. Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. God calls the rulers of the world and each of us to wisdom. The choice is ours. We can choose to live in rebellion and face the consequences, or we can humble ourselves, recognize God's authority, and find refuge in Him. The path of wisdom is the path of submission to God's will, of trusting in His perfect justice, and of living in His kingdom. Psalm 2 is not just a warning for world leaders. It's a reminder for each of us. In our own lives, we often face moments where we must decide whether to align ourselves with God's will or go our own way. The temptation to follow the path of rebellion may seem strong, but the psalm shows us the futility of opposing God's sovereign rule. His way is the way of peace, justice, and life. His kingdom will endure forever, and those who choose to follow him will share in the blessings of his reign. For those who choose to humble themselves before God and trust in his plan, there is a promise of blessing. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. This blessing is not just for kings and rulers, but for everyone who recognizes God's authority and seeks his protection. In the midst of the world's turmoil, we can find peace and security in the presence of God. His kingdom is one of justice, love, and truth, and those who dwell in it are safe from the storms of life. As we come to the conclusion of Psalm 2, we are reminded of the ultimate victory and blessing that come from trusting in God's sovereign reign. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. The message of this psalm is clear. God's authority is supreme, his plan is unchangeable, and his kingdom will endure forever. The world may rage, and nations may plot in vain, but God has already set his king on the throne. Jesus, the Anointed One, reigns over all, and his rule will bring peace, justice, and righteousness to the earth. For those who submit to God's will and trust in his king, there is refuge, there is peace, there is blessing. But for those who continue in rebellion, there is a warning. No matter how powerful or influential they may seem, their opposition to God's rule is futile. God's justice will prevail, and his kingdom will come. The psalm calls us all to respond. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. This is not a fearful trembling, but a reverence and awe of the God who holds all things in his hands. He is the creator, the sustainer, and the king. To serve him is to live in the fullness of his purpose for our lives, to trust in his wisdom, and to submit to his loving rule. Psalm 2 is a call to action. It's a reminder that we have a choice to make. Will we continue to fight against God's authority, or will we humble ourselves and receive the blessing of his kingdom? Will we choose rebellion, or will we choose to take refuge in the King of Kings? Blessed are all who take refuge in him. For in his kingdom there is peace, justice, and eternal life. As we submit to his reign, we find our true purpose and hope. His victory is assured, and those who trust in him will share in that victory.